Well, here we are, folks, for this lecture. I hope you've been doing well and keeping ahead of things. I have to apologize for the little late rollout of some of these lectures. I was quite sick during reading week, but I'm better now. So here's a new lecture for you. And tonight we're going to talk about the discourse of writing, and emphasis and coherence in writing. And how are we going to do that? Well, let's start with trivia first. And the trivia for today is, when is the next full moon? And as you might guess, the next full moon is October 31st, when we will have a hunter's moon, a blue moon, and a Halloween full moon, all on the same day. And the source for that, of course, is the Farmer's Almanac, which you can Google or look up. And if you don't know what those terms mean, you might be surprised. A hunter's moon, of course, is a way of describing the second full moon after the fall, starts. The harvest moon is the first one, and that took place around October 1st, and the Chinese Moon Festival. A blue moon is a full moon that appears twice in a month. So if you have two full moons in a month, it's a blue moon. And so if something happens once in a blue moon, it happens only occasionally, actually every 2 to 3 years usually. And of course, a Halloween full moon is when we have the spookiest moon, full moon, actually on Halloween. And I mention that because we've been talking about terminology and culture and interpretation. And so there's your trivia. What are we going to do during this lecture? Well, I'm going to first do a quick recap of where we were before, talking about words and readers and writers, where ambiguity gets generated and what goes wrong. And then we're going to talk about the way that the writing is like a discourse and has emphasis and focus. And that will lead us to a quick discussion of something called the given new contract in language. So let's do that. And of course, as always, we're talking about problems with language and how it works. And there are solutions based on how you approach these things. Okay. So, of course, we talked about words and the polysemantic nature of words in polysemous languages, right? Words have multiple meanings. They can mean different things. Their meanings differ over time. We talked about denotation and connotation, dictionary definitions versus cultural connotations for different words and word usage. We didn't talk much about neologism, but of course, new words in living languages get created, get coined, and used all the time. Sometimes they are built up from old words. Sometimes they're brand new words. For instance, in English, the word emoji didn't always exist. It's a neologism taken from another language, of course, but it also came from the English emoticon, which predates emojis in some ways. So there's this interaction between languages and invention. Here's another one. Podcasts didn't always exist. Obviously, that came from the idea of the old-fashioned iPod. Does anybody have an iPod anymore? I don't know. But and the combination of that and broadcast. So now we have podcasts, which are kind of like radio, but not quite. And just this year, of course, we have Zoom bombing, which is something that if I told you about 2 years ago, you probably would have looked at me and said, huh? What is a Zoom bomb, right? But there you go. It's a combination of Zoom and bomb in the sense of photobombing, which is also pretty new. If you talk to your grandparents about photobombing, will they know what that means? We'll see. Anyway, those are all issues with understanding language and using language as well. As new words come into focus and into use, people either know what they mean or they don't. If you're trying to learn the language, learning new words can also throw you a curveball. We talked about inappropriate formality. We talked about that a lot, of course. And I had you do that little assignment, which I hope you enjoyed. I'm looking at them all and reading your responses in eClass. One of the biggest problems with people trying to communicate in business is trying to speak too formally, right? So you couple all those ambiguous issues with extra formality and you get impenetrable text, very, very difficult to understand, which, actually suggests a real lack of audience awareness, right? If you're trying to communicate to your audience, you want to speak to them in a friendly or consultative fashion in North America. That's our culture. That's our business culture. Academic prose is a little bit higher register than business prose. But I would suggest that even when people write essays, they often write too formally in terms of sentence structure, even if they write formally in terms of the words they choose. And we'll talk about that in a second. And of course, as an antidote to this, we talked about planning and the document plan and how important it is. You can go back and look at those links on the website and understand that planning is really, really important to have some foresight about what you're doing and trying to communicate. We didn't really talk about the differences between other things in word choice and language. As a result of understanding that language is a social structure and part of a communal discourse, you won't be surprised actually to understand that jargons, specialized terminologies, are used by professions, subcultures, countercultures. If you want to speak in a way that your parents don't, or in a way that they don't understand when you're around, you can do it, I'm sure. Youth culture always has its way of describing things, as opposed to elder people who can also describe things in ways probably that you don't get either. So it's pretty interesting. Is it wrong? Now, you can pick up a lot of business textbooks, business communication textbooks, and they will tell you that, in fact, using jargon is incorrect. But that's not true. I've got a couple of examples of jargon here linked to their sources. Here's one. If you're a programmer, you might want to know about Kubernetes, which is a set of technologies for packaging web applications. Okay? But writing out Kubernetes is, difficult. So a lot of times people just write K8s, for Kubernetes, right? Terrible. But there it is, K8s, right? A lawyer might talk about what it means to be duty counsel in Canada. Now, if you don't know what duty counsel means, that's fine. It means a court-appointed lawyer that deals with some specific things in brief at the courthouse, right? If you're a duty counsel, that's what you do. That's a heck of a lot faster than explaining what it does. Doctors might use the Q sign, right? This is from a medical dictionary. You can look this up on Google, Q sign. A Q sign is emergency term slang for someone who is unconscious with their tongue hanging out, or indeed dead with their tongue hanging out. There's a certain amount of grim humor there that distances the doctors from the reality of what's going on, but it's also a lot faster and a lot less disturbing to people who are not doctors around, hanging around, if they need to communicate that. The same goes for specialized ideas in, say, religions. So here's the word transubstantiation, which might mean something to you or it might not mean something to you. It's a religious term that expresses a Christian definition of a sacred property within the communion service, right? If it doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. It's not supposed to. It's a specialized term. I know as translators, you all know how important specialized terms are and how important it is to get them right. So it's not wrong to use jargon. It's not wrong to use specialized terminology. But it is wrong if it's for the wrong audience. So if I want to talk about Kubernetes to a non-programming audience, I'm not going to use the short form K8s unless I explain it. I'm not going to talk about duty counsel if I'm talking about to a set of people who know they need to have something done at the courthouse, right? Or at least I'm going to explain it. And I'm not going to talk about a Q sign or transubstantiation to non-experts, or at least I'm not going to talk about it unless I go into depth explaining it, which I just did. Now, there's other ways that we hide words and that people use cultural terms or approaches to language to, do a couple of things. As with jargon, the use of euphemism, right, or acknowledging cultural taboos binds people together into a culture, right? If you speak like a lawyer, you use the terms like a lawyer, you're a lawyer and to some degree, right? And in fact, that's what law school does. That's what every professional school does. That's what every profession does. It gets you to profess its field by using the terms of the field. If you're an English major, you learn the terms that mark you as an English major. If you're a lawyer or a doctor or a nurse or a computer programmer or an engineer or a teacher, you all have terms that mean something to your profession. And that binds you to other practitioners, right? But as we've seen, it also excludes people who are not part of the profession. Okay? So understand that jargons, euphemisms, cultural taboos bind people together in a common shared experience and a symbolic experience, but it also excludes people outside of that common community. Okay? So euphemism is another one, right? Different communities use different euphemisms around their taboos or around things that are specifically or especially meant to be not spoken of aloud in graphic detail. So, when someone dies in our culture, we still say they passed away or they passed on, right? That's not strictly speaking true, but it is euphemistically true, right? You might say that people are sleeping together, but you don't mean they're literally sleeping together. Well, maybe they are, but they're also doing something else, right? And if you don't know what that means, you're outside of the culture, right? The military likes to talk about collateral damage in a bombing mission or in a tactical surgical strike. There's some euphemism for you. Collateral damage means people who are killed that they didn't mean to kill, usually civilians. So it's a pretty horrible thing. It's much nicer, it's much sweeter, and that's where the word euphemism comes from originally, to talk about collateral damage. Or indeed, friendly fire, another military term for when your own side is shooting at you in one way or another. So those euphemisms do the same thing. They hold the literal truth at bay, and they bind people together as a culture, and they exclude people from outside that culture. Okay? Now, are they wrong? No, of course they're not wrong. You don't have to go up to somebody who's recently, whose relative has died, and say that to them in blunt terms. Of course you don't. There's no reason to go around the cultural taboos on sexual relations 9 times out of 10, right? The military stuff is a little more tricky because, of course, it's used for political means and to sort of obfuscate the truth. And so you have to make decisions about that. But it's not wrong, okay? On the other hand, cliches, which is the overuse of terms to the extent that they no longer have any practical meaning, but are just noise sounds or words that you write because they're automatic, you should always avoid those. Unless you're talking about cliches, in which case you can't. But you know what I'm saying, right? Something like "it is what it is" in a business communication means nothing, right? If it means we can't change it and let's deal with it, then say we can't change it, let's deal with it. Now, I have to say, if you're texting somebody or instant messaging somebody, there's a lot of kind of social lubricant, phatic communication, I want to call it, which, that's PHATIC, by the way, folks, where you say things just to make somebody understand that you're on the same page as they are. A great example of phatic communication is when you meet somebody in the hallway, not during COVID-19, but back in normal times. You meet somebody in the hallway at school. You don't really know them, but you kind of know them. Maybe you saw them in a class. Maybe you didn't. You look at them and you say, "Hi, how are you?" And they go, "Hi, I'm fine." And you walk past each other, never to think about each other again. Are you really asking them how they are? If they stopped and actually told you how they were, how would you feel? So the point is, it's to acknowledge people's existence. And sometimes cliches, particularly in emerging media like texting, instant messaging, sometimes those cliches go forward in just acknowledging how people feel. But I would still say avoid them. Avoid cliche whenever you can. In fact, one of the key elements of being a good communicator, particularly in business communication, is to look at the things you're saying that are truly cliched, that have lost their meaning. And business is filled with them, right? Just Google business cliches, and you will find many, 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 many worn phrases that should never be worn again, if you know what I mean. So they're worn out, absolutely. Cliche actually comes from a cheap photographic process that would reproduce the same image over and over and over again. And that's exactly what you're doing. So be careful. If you're writing an email, if you're writing a report, be careful not to fall into the trap of just saying what comes automatically. Okay? And that's why planning is so important. That's why it's a good thing to think about really what your readers need and why it's important. Okay, so again, to review, how do you solve some of these problems? I think a laser-like focus on the kinds of things you're trying to solve, on the details and the actions you're trying to do, and who you're trying to convince and what you're trying to convince them of is the key. And I mean that even for those little documents that I had you look at. They're really tiny ones, like that register document. So let's have a look at that for a second. Why not? This is not that same document, but it's very similar, right? Look at this one. Here's a terrible letter that exhibits probably all of the things that we talked about pretty much. It may not be an automatic response, but a lot of it is cliched, a lot of it is too high register, and a lot of it, really doesn't work for the audience. So how about, let's look at it line by line here. With reference to your telephone call of February 12th and your letter of February 19th, which I have before me. Okay, first of all, do you really have to say that? Okay, do you really have to say I have your letter before me? And by the way, they don't have your telephone call before you, right? So it's incorrect, which is a terrible restrictive clause, by the way. But seriously, with reference to your telephone call of February 12th and your letter of February 19th, how many different ways could you say that that's much simpler than that? In fact, I would get rid of it entirely, right? Because really what this is about is the fact that the person is requesting a refund of repair costs on their microwave. But you didn't read it with interest or interest and concern, which sounds a lot like a contract, doesn't it? Because it's doubled. Remember we said high register speech has lots of duplication? Well, this is unnecessary duplication, right? And I'm not sure that interest and concern is really the issue here. And then look at this, next line. It is always a problem to us to know what to do when a major part fails shortly after the warranty period has expired. Now, as the audience, do you really care if it's a problem for you or not? I don't think so. This is the kind of philosophizing is terrible. It's also very indirect and, again, too high register. You would never say that to somebody, right? Don't you want to commiserate with them? Don't you want to sympathize with them, right? You don't want to start off by saying, my problem is I never know what to do. Okay, you're not much help if that's the truth. How about this? As you are no doubt well aware, okay, again, very, very high register construction here, right? The warranty for your microwave oven expired last December 23rd. Okay, now there's an actual fact that's buried in the middle of that paragraph. It's probably much more important to put this somewhere at the very beginning. But look, and as you say, the timer unit did not fail till February 11th. Now, I think they're trying to say that this did actually happen after the warranty period, right? Look at this next line. The manufacturer is adamant. Okay, now, how many of you quick know what adamant means or where it comes from? Okay, now from context, you can probably figure out that it means as firm as stone, that no warranty work will be accepted beyond 55 weeks after the original purchase date. Oh, look, the sentence goes on. And as you know, your failure occurred at the 58th week. Oh, look, we've done the math in a useless way for you, right? That's a useless way, right? If you've already said that the warranty expired in December and the failure didn't happen till later, you don't need to count the weeks for people. And this is just the icing on the proverbial too high register cake here. This, of course, clearly establishes the failure as occurring after the end of the warranty period. Okay, so this, of course, is a double, right? So there's this unspecified pronoun, which is coupled with, of course, clearly establishes. Seriously, it almost sounds like a lawyer's talking here, doesn't it? The failure, okay, as occurring, right? All of this could be rewritten to be much simpler, right? Much simpler. And basically, what does it say? It says the same thing as this sentence, which says the same thing as this. So why say it 3 times? Really? It's just adding insult to injury. And then finally, there's, yet you have a point. Well, never say to somebody you have a point. When you say that the previous warranty work carried out on your microwave oven November 22nd should have some bearing on your request. I mean, good heavens. You're not having an argument with them, so they don't have points. We're not trying to score points here, right? Because it corrected an occasional low power problem, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So, all they're trying to say is your machine has been repaired once, and maybe that was a problem, okay? And then look at this, but my hands are tied, okay? So all of this that I actually wrote to you is useless because I can't do anything for you. So I suggest you write directly to the manufacturer, et cetera, et cetera. I wish I could be of more tangible help to you. I can't think of a more high register way to say that, actually, offhand. It's like, sorry, can't help. Please go right to them yourself. This is too polite for zero help. And of course, if you were really in business, wouldn't you write to the manufacturer yourself? Wouldn't you pick up the phone and call them? Would you really put this back on your customer? I don't think so. But again, there's all kinds of ways that this is just too fancy, too high register, overly polite. And when you get to overly polite, it starts to sound kind of kooky. It starts to sound like a lawyer's writing it. It starts to sound like it's a more formal discourse than is actually taking place. Okay, so if you want to see this, I will post it on the website. Yeah, just for the heck of it. It's a pretty great example of what not to write. And it's very similar to the one that I had you guys post about in eClass. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. So planning is great. Okay, so let's talk about emphasis in writing. Okay, now when I speak, I can make all kinds of verbal emphasis. I can talk a lot louder, or I can talk very, very, very quietly, or I can pause for dramatic effect, or I can raise the pitch of my voice or lower it, or I can ask a question with my voice by raising it. There's all kinds of verbal emphasis that is related to the sound of speech and the sound of discourse. You don't notice it, but you're doing it all the time. Otherwise, you're speaking in a monotone, which, you probably never do with your friends. I did have a couple of professors who I suspect always spoke in monotone because they certainly lectured in monotone. One guy was so good, he actually spoke in sentences, commas, and paragraphs as he was lecturing to the blackboard. My point is, there's all kinds of ways to make verbal emphasis work, right? But how do you create that with writing? Well, the obvious way, and the way we're all taught in grade school, is with punctuation, right? With punctuation. We make emphasis with punctuation. So, a comma equals a pause. A semicolon equals a longer logical pause with a restriction, a logical restriction that follows, or an amplification in some cases. And if you don't know how to use a semicolon, I'm not going to tell you here, but definitely check it out in some of the other books I recommended at the beginning of the course. Okay, a colon, what does it mean? Pause and a list is coming, or a direct amplification of what you said before. All of the punctuation means something. A question mark means it's a question, obviously. Typography makes emphasis too, right? So even on this slide, the heading is bigger than the text, the bullet text. Therefore, what? Therefore, there is a structure that you can see. just visually, right? And even if you couldn't read this text, if it was on a billboard a half a mile away and the headline was bigger and the bullet points were smaller, you would understand that those bullet points somehow related to that large headline because there's a visual cue there that mimics emphasis, right? Obviously, there's some exclamation marks here on that last bullet. It also mimics emphasis, right? So if you put an exclamation mark next to something, it means enthusiasm or importance. You never need more than one, okay? I mean, informally, you might. If you're Stephen King and you like to write that way, I personally hate reading stuff like that. You will use all kinds of visual cues to emphasize your text, including way too many exclamation marks in the novels. Not in the short stories. I don't know why, but it's the truth. Of course, sentence structures also make things emphatic. And even more than sentence structures, the way paragraphs go together actually lead you through the logical structure of what you're reading. We call that coherence. And the two things, emphasis and coherence, are linked. Another word for emphasis, by the way, is focus. And you have to ask yourself, what do you focus on, right? What are the things that make you focus on something? And here I've got a good example. I'm sure by now you've noticed the red dot if you're actually watching this. There's a red dot in the middle of the slide, actually to the right of the slide on the right-hand side. What does it mean? I don't know. It doesn't mean anything. But our brains are pretty wired to think that it must mean something because it's different than everything else. So if I actually took away the text on this slide and just had the red dot, all your eye would go to is the red dot. Why? Because it's different. It's different, and it's different than the background. And for some evolutionary reason, we are programmed to look at differences as meaningful. This is very similar to Saussure's insight on how language works as thought sounds and as differential sounds, right? In this case, though, because writing is graphic, we're looking at the graphic impact of difference, right? The background hasn't changed, but something is new in the foreground. And perhaps in our evolutionary past, that means we see a tiger coming through grasslands, and it's important, right? But it's definitely new information that we find interesting and should be meaningful, even if it isn't. So we're going to talk about how focus and emphasis gets created at the discourse level, right? Focus depends on the context or the background and the difference you are looking for, which is generally new information. So let's look at a couple of examples. Here's a great linguistic example of how English works. Okay, this is a completely random sentence. I'm pretty sure you've never seen it before or heard it before, unless you were sneaking a peek while I had PowerPoint open in the previous slide. Pretty sure you didn't know what this was. Okay, if you don't know who Dylan Thomas is, by the way, great 20th century poet from Wales, and the sentence is, Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. Okay, now, where is the focus or emphasis in that sentence? Well, you might be tempted to say there isn't any focus. There isn't any emphasis because, I don't know, it all seems pretty important, doesn't it? I mean, Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. Maybe it's Dylan Thomas, maybe it's him being born. Anyway, the point here, and this is a weird one, is that most linguists would say because English sentences are generally divided into two parts, a subject and an object, and you might remember that, or a subject and a predicate, more precisely, the emphasis falls on the predicate. It falls at the end of the sentence if there is no context. So Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. The emphasis is on was born in Swansea. The topic, or what the sentence is about, is Dylan Thomas, the subject. So in English, we have something called end focus, where the predicate gets the focus if there is no context. Okay, now think about this for a second. How many sentences do you run into that have no context? Think about it. Okay, the answer better be none, because except for classroom situations like this or linguistic textbooks where you open it up and they'll give you an example, like, they'll be talking about something with language and say something out of the blue, like the 12 ducks had ducklings on the pond in the winter. Okay, I just made that up in my head. That's a sentence with no context whatsoever, except I gave you a context. It's an example in a linguistics textbook, which helps you understand why I would say it. If I just walked up to you and said that, it would be disconcerting to say the least. So this is a sentence that you didn't plan on, and outside of a classroom, you don't generally get sentences that have no context. In fact, what normally happens is sentences, the same sentence, is answering a question or responding to a context. Okay, so if the context for that sentence was, where was Dylan Thomas born? Then obviously the emphatic information, or the information you're looking for, the new information, is in Swansea. So where was Dylan Thomas born? Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. Who was born in Swansea? Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. Now you see how the emphasis has changed between those two things? Okay, and finally, what happened to Dylan Thomas in Swansea? Dylan Thomas was born in Swansea. Now I want you to notice a couple things here. The emphasis changes as a result of the context. It changes as a result of the questions, doesn't it? Yes. And I want you to notice that in the question is the information that gets repeated. That is the context. It's called the given context because it's given, right? Where was Dylan Thomas born? Dylan Thomas was born. Okay. In Swansea is the new information for that question. So you have given information or contextual information, and you have new information. And discourse in writing is generally about how the patterns of context and new information play out. Your understanding is directly related to the writer's ability to present focused information in this way, such that you have the context for the new information that's coming. I'm sure you've all had the experience of looking at a technical document or a professional document that's outside of your realm, right? And going, I don't understand any of this. And the reason you don't understand it is because you don't have the given information, right? You don't have the context. Go read a scientific journal article, right? Go read a neurologist's article or something. You will not understand it. You won't understand it because even though it's in English and even though it has, normal sentence structures, it has way too much new information for you to wrap your head around. And if you do understand it, it's because you're either part of that field or because you understand the background for what's going on. Okay, so this is a very, very simple concept with incredibly important consequences. If I had a nickel for every time I saw technical communication that got this wrong, where they put the new information before the contextual information, I'd be a very rich guy and I wouldn't have to work. It's true, right? Because the important thing from a technologist's perspective is often, what's the new stuff we're doing? Look at how great it is. But unfortunately, people don't learn that way. You need to understand the context before you can talk about new information. And that's how focus and emphasis in writing is created. Here's a great example of this, right? If I tell you to draw a triangle with a T attached to it, right? And you could do that any number of different ways. Two possible ways might be this, right? There's a triangle with a T attached to it. But if I told you, draw a triangle with a T attached to it and it should look like a wine glass, I guarantee you're only going to draw the one on the left, right? You're not going to draw the upside down Christmas tree with a T on it, okay? So the context for what you're asking in this trivial example is super important. It is the given information that creates the understanding you get. Now, this is super important. I'm using super a lot, sorry. It's very important for communication of all kinds business communication, no exceptions. And I have two examples here that I've been using for a long time. They're great examples, and we're going to step through them as we go through this. So take a pause, take a breath, go get a coffee, whatever it is you want. I want to go through these two articles, these two excerpts from articles. They're from a magazine that sadly no longer exists called The Sciences. It's the Journal of the New York Academy of Sciences, and it was a spectacularly great magazine. It won all kinds of awards, and it was written by scientists for scientists, but not in the way you would think, not in the way that Scientific American is written. In fact, The Sciences had a great understanding of the fact that their audience would not be specialists in the articles that were written. So if you have an article written by a neurologist, it would be written so that a general practitioner or a physicist or a chemist could understand it. And if you had an article written by a physicist, it would be written in a way that a GP or an engineer could understand it, which is brilliant. It's some of the best technical communication I've ever read, in that it gets to the heart of ideas without misrepresenting them, but without going into a jargon-filled, specialized discourse. They're very good, in fact, at creating the patterns of the given new that promote understanding. So let's start. We're going to start with the viral superhighway, which actually comes from 1998. Okay, so we're going to do that. Give me 1 second here. It's not showing me what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, so here's the viral superhighway. This is, again, a little bit too on the nose for the year we've been having, but nevertheless, I want you to think about this. And usually when I show this in class, I can basically say, don't read the text, just read the first part. But let's look at this piece by piece. So the viral superhighway, if I just say that, or if you just saw it right off the bat, no context, I didn't tell you what the sciences were all about, you go, well, what is that all about? I mean, these days, in 2020, you might actually say, oh, it's probably about COVID, right? But it could be something else. It could be computer viruses, right? It could be the information superhighway or the information highway that often gets talked about. So there's the viral superhighway, and then there's this, okay? Environmental disruptions and international travel have brought on a new era in human illness, one marked by diabolical new diseases. Okay, so now we've moved from our understanding of the viral superhighway down to environmental disruptions and international travel as the cause for new human illnesses. So now we understand this viral superhighway as something else. And do you see how between those two things, the context for your understanding this gets created, right? Gets created stronger and stronger. Here's a picture, right? So you glance down and you see there's a picture. And the interesting thing about the sciences, too, I have to say as an aside, is that they did not illustrate this with graphs or data graphics or with quantitative representations, but with fine art. All of the articles in the sciences was illustrated with fine art. So here's a 15th century detail from a painting by Vincent de Beauvais, Le Miroir Historial, La Peste en Allemagne, right? The plague in Germany. And you can see these funky dragon-like creatures flying around the Black Death. And what do you get next in this article? Next you get a quote from the Bible, from 2 Samuel 24:15. So the Lord sent a pestilence upon Israel from the morning until the appointed time, and there died of the people from Dan to Beersheba 70,000 men. Okay, so do you see how these things, the title, the subtitle, and the quote are building up what this article is about? Do you have any doubt what the article is about? Well, if you do, look at the next paragraph here. Swarms of crop-destroying locusts, rivers fouled with blood, lion-headed horses breathing fire and sulfur. The Bible presents a lurid assortment of plagues described as acts of retribution by a vengeful God. Indeed, real-life epidemics such as the influenza outbreak of 1918, which killed 21 million people in a matter of months, can be so sudden and deadly that it's easy, even for non-believers, to view them as angry messages from the beyond. Okay, so do you see how they've gone from the headline, the subheading, the picture, the quote from the Bible, to a discussion of biblical plagues into history, and a history that's all too close to us this year, the influenza outbreak of 1918. Look at the next paragraph. How reassuring it was then when the march of technology began to give people some control over the scourges of the past. In the 1950s, the Salk vaccine and later the Sabin vaccine dramatically reduced the incidence of polio, and by 1980, a determined effort by health workers worldwide eradicated smallpox, a disease that had afflicted humankind since earliest times with blindness, disfigurement, and death, killing nearly 300 million people in the 20th century alone. Okay, now I want you to think about that for a second. That is the population of the United States, right? So, as illnesses go, smallpox is a scourge, as they say, right? And it's a terrible, terrible disease that was actually conquered, right? But look at the next paragraph. But those optimistic years in the second half of our century seem with hindsight to have been an era of inflated expectations, even arrogance. In 1967, the Surgeon General of the United States, William H. Stewart, announced that victory over infectious diseases was imminent, a victory that would close the book on modern plagues. Sadly, we now know differently. Not only have deadly and previously unimagined new illnesses such as AIDS and Legionnaire's disease emerged in recent years, but historical diseases that just a few decades ago seemed to have been tamed are returning in virulent, drug-resistant varieties. Tuberculosis, the ancient lung disease that haunted 19th century Europe, afflicting, among others, Chopin, Dostoevsky, and Keats, is aggressively mutating into strains that defy standard medicines. As a result, modern TB victims must undergo a daily drug regimen so elaborate that health department workers often have to personally monitor patients to make sure they comply. Meanwhile, bacteria and viruses in food from chicken to strawberries to alfalfa sprouts are sickening as many as 80 million Americans each year. And those are only symptoms of a much more general threat. Deaths from infectious diseases in the United States rose 58% between 1980 and 1992. 29 new diseases have been reported in the past 25 years, a few of them so blood-curdling and bizarre that description of them brings to mind tacky horror movies. Ebola virus, for instance, can in just a few days reduce a healthy person to a bag of teeming flesh, spilling blood and organ parts from every orifice. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which killed the choreographer George Balanchine in 1983, eats away at its victims' brains until they resemble wet sponges. Never slow to fan mass hysteria, Hollywood has capitalized on the phenomenon with films such as Outbreak, in which a monkey carrying a deadly new virus from Central Africa infects unwitting Californians and starts an epidemic that threatens to annihilate the human race. The reality about infectious diseases is less sensational but alarming nonetheless. Gruesome new pathogens such as Ebola are unlikely to cause a widespread epidemic because they sicken and kill so quickly that victims can be easily identified and isolated. On the other hand, the seemingly innocuous practice of overprescribing antibiotics for bad colds could ultimately lead to untold deaths as familiar germs evolve to become untreatable. We are living in the twilight of the antibiotic era. Within our lifetimes, scraped knees and cut fingers may return to the realm of fatal conditions. Okay, so sorry for the scare and for the article that's a little too on point in 2020. But did you see, as I read through that, how the author built up the focus in that article? Did you understand that every single sentence here gives you new information based on old information? And in fact, the paragraphs themselves do the job of creating this focus created by the given new. And I don't know whether your high school teachers taught you how paragraphs work. If they're like mine, they basically said, well, you introduce an idea, you expand it, and then you conclude it, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't understand what that means. What it really means is a paragraph continues the context of what comes before it. The first paragraph needs to establish that context. And the first sentence is, just like the subject in English, the topic of the paragraph. It's what the paragraph is all about, right? The end of the paragraph, the last sentence, has to sum up and give you new information so that you can get propelled into the next paragraph. And that's what this writing does so well. In fact, if you want a quick check for the coherence of any article, anything you've written, business, essay, whatever, you can look at the first sentences of each one of your paragraphs to see if you've got it right. Because if I'm right, you should be able to understand an article just reading the first sentence of every paragraph. Now, you won't understand it fully, but you'll understand what it's about. It's given information. So let's look. Swarms of crop-destroying locusts, rivers fouled with blood, lion-headed horses breathing fire and sulfur. The Bible presents a lurid assortment of plagues described as acts of retribution by a vengeful God. That's the first sentence. Here's the next one. How reassuring it was then when the march of technology began to give people some control over the scourges of the past. But now those optimistic years in the second half of our century now seem, with hindsight, to have been an era of inflated expectations, even arrogance. And those are only symptoms of a much more general threat. The reality about infectious diseases is less sensational but alarming nonetheless. Through international travel, global commerce, and the accelerating destruction of ecosystems worldwide, people are inadvertently exposing themselves to a Pandora's box. Do you see how that works with these first sentences? How the topic is being built up every paragraph, right? And then within each paragraph, every one of those ideas is expanded and then concluded to give you this pattern of the given and the new, of the background and the new information. Good writing coheres this way. It has this logic. Good, understandable, reader-based prose has a logic that uses the given new. It has a logic that lets people follow along easily. Now, this is not simple stuff. And these are not simple sentences. And this is not written to a grade 4 or 5 level. Absolutely not. Right? This is written for people with university degrees. Okay? But it's pretty understandable. Why? Because they followed this focus. Because there isn't much jargon here. Because it is absolutely brilliant in the way it builds up the context of understanding. So that by the time you get to the thesis at this last sentence here on the first page, right? By the time you get there, you already understand the background. Okay, we can look at another one here. Perhaps not quite so gruesome for for this. This is a less gruesome article from the same magazine, same year, right? And it's about something called Go. And if you say all systems go, what do you immediately think of? Okay. If I just said that to you, or you saw this, you might think of rockets. All systems go, right? You might think of computers. You might think of all kinds of things. Certainly systems. Go means green or good. But if you look at this picture and you understand it, you might also think of something else, because the people in this picture are playing the ancient game of Go, which is what this article is all about. It's about how computers can play against people with Go. Okay, so let's look at this article and how it's written. Okay, so here we go. This is, again, 1998. This past July, the annual conference of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence was marked by an oddly heroic event. Throughout the conference, held in Providence, Rhode Island, world-class players of chess, checkers, and other games pitted their skills against state-of-the-art computer adversaries. For the most part, the humans either lost or barely eked out victories. Then a 27-year-old native of New Mexico named Janice Kim challenged a computer to the oldest, most complex game of all, Go. When a video image of the match flickered onto one of the oversized monitors in the Hall of Champions, Audience members laughed and shook their heads in disbelief. The computer was being granted a 25-stone handicap. Kim is an exceptional player, the only female Go player the West has ever produced, but this seemed ridiculous. The first stone she placed looked like a lone paratrooper dropped into an enemy garrison. I was the commentator for the match, yet I had not seen a handicap like that in a long time. When I started playing Go as a high school sophomore living in Chappaqua, New York, my father, then an experienced amateur, started me out at 23 stones. I did not stay at that handicap for long. The rules of the game are easy to learn, much simpler than those of chess, and I was attracted to the combination of restraint and aggression, quick intuition, and cold calculation that playing Go well requires. I also like to win. I devoured all the Go books I could and spent every weekend at the Go Club in New York City. By 1988, still a high school senior, I was the U.S. representative to the World Go Youth Championship in Paris, and I had made arrangements to apprentice myself to a Japanese Go master in the fall. In spite of its prestige and history in Japan, its huge popularity in Korea, and its cachet among European intellectuals, Go is all but unknown in the United States. As a result, we Go players are used to explaining ourselves. We can intone an inevitably stilted litany in our sleep. Go is an ancient game of strategy that originated in China some 4,000 years ago. The board is 19-line grid. The stones are black and white, all alike, and the subtleties that develop from those simple elements make Go the deepest game in the world. Go is a game of construction. The board starts out empty, and the opponents, one playing black, the other white, take turns placing their stones on the intersections of the grid lines, trying to surround and control unclaimed territories. Once played, the stones do not move. Go is also a game of war. Once a group of stones is completely surrounded, it's removed from the board. As conflicts arise over territory, each player struggles to surround and capture his opponent's stones while protecting his own. The game ends by agreement when neither player can improve his position. But that only begins to explain the true character of the game. If chess is a battle, Go is an entire campaign. It is a long game in which a number of battles may rage simultaneously, none of them decisive, and a single move can affect the entire board. There is a saying, mostly among Go aficionados, I have to admit, that Go is to chess as poetry is to double-entry bookkeeping. Okay, so if we look at this as we did the first article, built up from the All Systems Go headline through the picture of people playing Go in ancient Japan, through to the paragraph structures, you will find the same elements as we did before. A really, really good control of the logic of the article, how it coheres, how it establishes context. First, let's look at the first sentences. This past July, the annual conference of the American... Whoops, not working. Try this one more time. This past July... There we go. The annual conference of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence was marked by an oddly heroic event. When a video image of the match flickered onto one of the oversized monitors in the Hall of Champions, audience members laughed and shook their heads in disbelief. The computer was being granted a 25-stone handicap. I was the commentator for the match, yet I had not seen a handicap like that in a long time. In spite of its prestige and history in Japan, its huge popularity in Korea, and its cachet among European intellectuals, Go is all but unknown in the United States. Go is a game of construction. The board starts out empty. Then the opponents, one playing black, the other white, take turns placing their stones in the intersection of the grid lines, trying to surround and control unclaimed territories. But that only begins to explain the true nature of the game. Unfortunately, a 25-stone handicap gives the game's true depth and beauty little chance to emerge. So you see how those first paragraphs, again, they don't give you all the details. That's the new information. But they explain the context, and then the new information follows. And if you look at the last paragraph, the last sentence of each paragraph, you'll see that it sums up what came before it and introduces the next level of what's going on. So here's a great example. The board is a 19-line grid. The stones are black and white, all alike, and the subtleties that develop from those simple elements make Go the deepest game in the world. Go is a game of construction. Do you see how those fit together? Do you see how the given information establishes what will come next as new information, and then that in turn becomes given information. Reading is a serial process. Even if you skip ahead, even if you skip around, the visual structure of the paragraphs, the paragraph structure itself, the sentence structure within the paragraphs, all work to create topic and focus. They all work to create emphasis without punctuation, right? Or not in addition to punctuation, in addition to typography, right? Obviously, there's a main break between this paragraph that I'm pointing to here with the mouse and this paragraph with the drop cap, right? That's a section of text, right? Introduction and then emerging story. Okay, so all of those things have meaning. But what I want you to really get from this little demonstration is that well-written texts have a logic of emphasis and focus. And this is really, really important for business communicators. It's important for other communicators too, as you can see. But it's very, very important for business communication to get that context right. Now, I will say one thing. As part of being reader-focused and not writer-focused, you should probably make sure if you have an important ask of somebody in your own company, if you're going to ask them to try to do something, it probably should come very early in the text, and then you can explain the context afterwards. It doesn't have to emerge the way these journalistic stories do, but it does have to follow the given new contract. If people don't understand the context for what you're asking them, they can't do it. If they don't understand the context of the sentences in the paragraphs, they can't do it. If they don't understand the polysemantic nature of the words you're using, they can't act on those sentences. If they don't understand the language due to cultural barriers or due to jargons or due to other ambiguities baked into the language, they can't process it and can't understand it, let alone understand it quickly and easily. So I hope that made sense to you as examples. Those two articles, I think, are still really, really good. They're great exemplars of complex, advanced writing, certainly within the realm of business communication. The business in this case happens to be science, but still within that professional realm. And they're really easy to understand, even as outsiders with a little training. Okay, so in sum, I want to emphasize again that planning is really crucial to success here. If you plan on what you're going to convince people about, what the most important parts of the issue are that you're writing to, if you're planning about what your audience really needs, you will get this right. It will be a lot easier than if you just start writing, okay, from a draft. It'll be a lot easier if you plan first. And I don't care which plan you use, like I said before, but try to do it, okay? I really want you to break down your writing practice and do it more slowly. I know nobody wants to do things more slowly. Trust me on this, though. If you undo what you think you know and try to do it in a different way, you'll get better and better with practice, and it will become faster and faster with practice. I hope you also understood from this that emphasis is built up from context. In discourse, in dialogue between two people, which really what writing is, and it's not just between two people, but it's between the author, the text, and readers, emphasis gets built up from what comes before. What comes before often comes just from the field or the tenor of the or the mode of the text, right? If you go to a library and you start pulling out books on sociology, you expect them to be about sociology, not science fiction, right? If you are looking at a book and it looks like it's a play script, then you expect it to be performed. In other words, the mode of the thing signals some context. Context is everywhere, but good writing emphasizes the context and makes sure the reader knows what you're talking about in general before you get to the specific new information. By the way, as an aside for technical writers, this is where analogy and metaphor is so important. If you can create a good metaphor for something, then you're really taking people across a bridge from old knowledge into new knowledge. So if I say your computer system has a desktop with places you can put things and a garbage can where you can drag stuff to be recycled or trashed. That's a metaphor. It doesn't really have any of those things, but it's sort of instantly understandable, right? Good. Okay, I hope you understand that. And finally, your readers, business readers who don't have time to figure out what you're talking about, really expect the given new to be respected and really expect you to provide it for them. Again, I would emphasize that one of the things you can do to improve your writing right away is put anything you're asking of people right very close to the front, if not the very first sentence, right? Something like, I need you to approve these things by Friday. Okay, now that seems to go across against everything I've just said about context. But then you can provide the context, right? Rather than providing a whole story first and then saying, I need you to approve these by Friday. Okay? That is also about emphasis, because what comes first is often more important. You still need to explain it. It still needs to be within a context that's understandable. Okay. I will see you next lecture, and I'll post that up very, very shortly as well. I hope you enjoy this, and I hope you're getting ready for the midterm. Don't worry about it, but it is coming up. Okay? Any questions, as always, email me or write them in the general questions section of the e-class. Thanks, folks.